For all its beauty and splendor, the wilderness can be a cruel teacher. To dare the edge of life is to brush against death, and in that cold touch lies the raw marrow of existence. You leap from cliffs, climb sheer rock, fly through the air on nothing but courage and sinew, and for what? To feel alive, yes, but also to test God's mercy, to thumb your nose at the steady march of time. There's poetry in the madness, no doubt, but poetry has a price. Do not think the mountain forgives. Do not think the rope will always hold or the wind will always lift. Nature is indifferent, and your bravery is but a flicker against her eternal gaze. She rewards the bold, yes, but she buries the foolish, and sometimes they are one and the same. So go ahead, plunge into the abyss, feel the rush, the fleeting glory that sets your veins alight. But know this, every stunt you pull, every line you cross, is a roll of the dice. And one day, the dice may not favor you. One day, the cliff might crumble, the parachute might fail, the tide might turn. One day, the call might come, and the price will be paid in tragedy. Let's venture back to the savage wilderness where survival is earned, not given. This is the Outdoor Disasters, Reckless Stunts, and Extreme Sports Disasters Marathon number 2. For Jordan Hatmaker, her skydive jump would be a nightmare. Jordan Hatmaker had always been a seeker of thrills, as natural to it as breathing. After college, she found herself working for a defense contractor, selling equipment to the military. In the beginning, Jordan started skydiving purely for the thrill, a rush to break free from the routine of everyday life. The first time she tasted the sky was in 2015, strapped to another jumper in a tandem skydive. It felt like coming home, and she couldn't shake it. Since I was a kid, all I wanted was to fly, she'd say. If anyone asked what animal I'd be, I'd say a bird. Tackling something that wild gives you a sense of pride nothing else can. Jordan kept jumping, and it became more. She found herself drawn to the tight-knit community of skydivers, a group bound by risk and exhilaration. More than that, skydiving gave her a deep sense of confidence and achievement. Not everyone had the courage to jump from a plane alone, and each time she landed, she felt an overwhelming pride in what she had just done, a triumph that set her apart from the ordinary. In 2020, Jordan decided to get her skydiving license. Her friends pushed her to do it, to make it official. With a license, she could jump solo. It was cheaper that way. She could jump anywhere. The training cost $5,000. The gear another $3 to $5, but after that, it was just $25 a jump. She went through the training. She got the license. Soon, she was in the sky as often as she could manage. The drop zone became home. The air felt like hers. But the following year, Jordan would face something in the sky that would test her in ways she never imagined, a moment of sheer terror that would change everything. November 14th, 2021 dawned clear and calm over Suffolk, Virginia. A perfect day to jump. This was her 16th solo jump. That wasn't much. Not in the skydiving world. Real experience didn't come until 100 jumps, maybe more. Jordan had only jumped 14 times before. She was still a novice. The fear was there, but it was the good kind. The kind that kept her sharp. It was the reason she had started skydiving in the first place. She drove 40 minutes to the hangar. The roads were quiet, stretching through empty fields and under an open sky. It was the kind of sky that called to her, the kind that made her feel small and limitless all at once. At 1:30 in the afternoon, she boarded the plane with 15 others. They went through the motions, checked the gear, ran through the safety rituals. The plane climbed, the hum of the engine steady. Jordan sat near the door, her fingers tightening around the straps of her harness. She looked down. 4,100 meters below, the world stretched out in all directions. She mapped the descent in her head. She had done this before. She could do it again. The light turned green. Time to jump. She moved to the edge, the rush of air tearing at her jumpsuit. Then she leaped. The world tilted, and she fell. Fast. The wind roared in her ears. the pressure of it pushing against her limbs. The earth surged up to meet her at 200 kilometers an hour. She counted. 5 seconds. Another 300 meters down. The thrill was there, deep in her bones. At 1,200 meters, she reached back and deployed the pilot's chute. There was a moment of stillness as the main canopy caught the air, billowing open above her. The free fall ended. The world slowed. Now, she drifted, weightless, the ground coming up steady and sure. She landed soft, her feet touching down with practiced ease. The first jump was clean, no trouble, no mistakes. She unhooked her harness and breathed. The sky felt good. The air was crisp. She didn't wait long before going back up. Once I got back down, I was actually going to leave because it was getting later in the day. But she asked if I wanted to do another jump, and I thought, why not? The first one went well, she said. She didn't have long to savor it. Soon they were back up for a second jump. The mood was light, laughter filling the plane. Another jump, another safety routine. The others were excited, laughing, exchanging high fives and fist bumps, the kind of ritual that eased the tension. She joined in, but her mind was already ahead, running through the drills, the ones they had practiced on the ground. She had done them before, but the sky was different. There was no room for mistakes here. The green light flashed. Time to jump again. But this time, at 1,680 meters or 5,500 feet, she was jumping lower than expected. She needed to pull the pilot chute at 1,200 meters or 3,900 feet. They leaped one after another, falling into the vast open sky. The wind tore at them, howling past their ears. Jordan felt the rush of it, the force pressing against her body. It was the same every time, a mix of terror and exhilaration, like standing on the edge of something that could swallow you whole. At 1,370 meters or 4,500 feet, they tracked away from each other. It was instinct, a rule drilled into them from the start. No one wanted tangled chutes. She angled her body, pushing away from the others, carving space between them. Jumping lower than expected, she wouldn't have as much time to pull the chute. So she rushed it. She was not steady enough. She reached back, pulled the pilot chute. Something was wrong. The small chute whipped out, but didn't do what it was supposed to do. Instead of pulling free, it wrapped around her right leg, tightening, locking itself in place. The main parachute stayed packed. Instead of unfurling, it caught her leg, pulling her into an impossible tangle. The main chute stayed locked in its bag. The ground kept rushing up. She knew the feeling of free fall, the controlled kind, the kind with an end. This was different. This was wrong. There was no slowing down, no transition into the calm drift under the canopy. There was only the wind screaming past her ears and the growing weight in her gut. I just went into survival mode when it wrapped around my leg and the main parachute wasn't out. How can I get myself out of this situation? I have got to get this off of my leg, she recalled. She tried to kick, to shake it loose, but the chute held fast. The earth was coming faster now, faster than it should. Seconds passed, precious and unforgiving. She had to act. There was no time to think, only time to move. The ground came up fast, faster than she thought possible. There was no stopping it, no slowing down. It was coming, and it would hit hard. Maybe I'll break a leg, Jordan thought. It was a small hope, a stupid one, but she had always been an optimist. Then the reserve chute snapped open. The force of it yanked her upright, pulling her out of the spin. She had seconds to react. She gripped the toggles, forcing herself to focus, steering toward a grassy patch instead of the asphalt runway she was heading towards. The ground was close now, too close, but she had a chance. A brief flicker of relief, then the main chute deployed. It was the worst thing that could have happened. The force from the reserve parachute coming out actually made the main canopy come out of its bag. The two chutes pulled her in opposite directions, one jerking her up, the other yanking her down. The force twisted her violently. She was no longer falling, she was being thrown. Faster now, harder. Toward the ground she had almost escaped. The impact was like fire. The world exploded in pain. It came from everywhere at once. Her ankle, her back, her legs. She gasped, but the breath barely made it out. It was as if the earth itself had taken her, wrapped her in its weight. She tried to move. Nothing. She tried again. Nothing. The blue stretched forever, indifferent. The wind moved through the trees. It should have been peaceful. It wasn't. She opened her mouth and screamed, "Help me!" No one came right away. She was alone with the pain, with the raw, burning certainty that something was wrong. Very wrong. She swallowed hard, tried to breathe through it. "Please, God, don't let me be paralyzed," she whispered. Minutes stretched. 5, maybe more. The skydiving club members reached her. They circled, their faces pale, hands hovering but afraid to touch. No one knew what to do. They knew better than to move her. Moving could make it worse. So she lay there, waiting to know what damage had been done. I couldn't feel anything or move anything below my waist. Everything above my waist was just on fire, burning. It was a very intense pain. Other skydivers came running over, and then the people who were in the hangar that managed the place all came running over too. I couldn't really do anything. Obviously, I was on the ground, and I could just hear and see buzzing above my head like people a little frantic trying to figure out what to do. The hangar being in the middle of nowhere, the paramedics arrived 30 minutes later, working carefully, lifting her onto a board. The pain was fierce. Her scream rang out. Then she heard the helicopters thrum. They put her under ketamine for the ride to the trauma center. Her injuries were severe. A shattered ankle, broken shin, and a spinal injury that led to a spinal fluid leak. Jordan spent a month at Norfolk General. The broken back and leg were bad, but the spinal cord injury was worse. The doctors didn't know what would happen. They never did. They were careful with their words. No promises, no certainties. "We're not sure if you'll walk again," they said, "but you can move your toes. That's something, that's progress. You might regain feeling, but it will take time." She did what she could in the hospital. Inpatient physical therapy, occupational therapy. Every movement was a battle. The paralysis limited her, but she fought against it. The first few weeks were the hardest. Then, something changed. A small shift, a little more strength. They worked harder then, pushing until the last days in the hospital. When she left, the fight didn't stop. Healthcare workers came to the house, helped her shower, helped with the things she couldn't do alone. She never doubted she would recover, not once. The thought of failure didn't exist. She would walk. That was all there was to it. And in February 2022, just 3 months after the crash, she walked. 2.5 years later, the injury still lingered. Some things never fully healed. The spinal cord damage had side effects. Internal organs didn't function the way they should. She still went to therapy almost every week. But being the optimist, Hatmaker took the ordeal as a challenge, a temporary roadblock. In 2024, in an interview with Inside Edition, she stated, "I've been to Mount Everest since then. I went a year after the accident. I've done lots of hikes. I did a tandem skydive this past fall, and just going about my normal life and just trying to continue to live it to the fullest. I'm not sure if I'll go skydiving alone ever again. It's not out of the realm of possibilities for me though. I've always been an open book, and the more I talk about something, the easier it gets for me. I've just had people reach out after sharing my story, and it makes me want to continue to share my story just to help people going through injuries or, whatever the case may be, a hard time in their life." For Robert Overacker, his Niagara Falls stunt would be a catastrophic failure. Robert Overacker was born on July 4, 1956, in Santa Monica, California. Growing up in the shadow of the Pacific Ocean, he developed a love for the elements that shaped his world. From a young age, Robert was captivated by the idea of pushing boundaries. Throughout his life, Robert has worked various jobs, but none of them could satisfy his thirst for adventure. His true passion was stunts and extreme sports, but it wasn't just about the thrill for him. Robert was searching for something deeper, something that would give his life meaning beyond the fleeting rush of adrenaline. This search led him to an unexpected cause: homelessness. In the vibrant and diverse communities of California, Robert had seen firsthand the struggles of those who lived on the streets. He was moved by their plight. Society often turned a blind eye to their suffering. Robert became determined to do something about it. He realized that raising awareness about homelessness required more than just words. People needed to be shocked out of their complacency and confronted with the harsh realities that so many face daily. And so, an idea began to take shape in his mind, a stunt that would capture the world's attention and force them to see what he had seen. For 7 years, Robert meticulously planned his most dangerous stunt yet, going over Niagara Falls. It wasn't just about the danger or the thrill. It was about making a statement. Niagara Falls, with its awe-inspiring beauty and terrifying power, was the perfect symbol of the edge between life and death. If he could survive the falls, it would be a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and a stark reminder of the precarious existence of those living on the streets. Robert's friends tried to talk him out of it, fearing for his life. They knew he was serious about this cause, but they couldn't bear the thought of losing him. Twice he agreed to postpone the stunt, but the pull of his mission was too strong. He couldn't ignore the call to action, the need to make the world listen. On October 1st, 1995, 39-year-old Robert Overacker ventured to Niagara Falls to attempt the audacious stunt, fully aware that stunts at Niagara Falls have a long and often tragic history, with several people losing their lives in their pursuit of fame, adventure, or personal goals. Attempting a stunt at Niagara Falls, particularly one as daring as going over the edge on a jet ski and relying on a parachute to survive, would undoubtedly be a momentous and intense experience. The mindset and feelings of someone on the day of such an attempt would likely encompass a range of emotions driven by a mix of excitement, fear, determination, and focus. Overacker was likely reviewing every detail of his plan repeatedly in his mind, mentally running through the logistics of the stunt, ensuring that he was familiar with each step he needed to take. Overacker likely double-checked his equipment, ensuring that the jet ski was in optimal condition and that the parachute was packed correctly. Any last-minute adjustments or checks would be critical. The anticipation of the stunt would cause a significant adrenaline rush. His senses were heightened, making him acutely aware of every sound, movement, and even the weather conditions. Robert likely felt anxious, knowing he was about to do something incredibly dangerous that few have ever attempted. But this stunt wasn't just about personal glory or achievement. It was for a cause he believed desperately needed more attention, and something as daring as going over Niagara Falls perfectly fit the bill. Although Robert Overacker thought he was prepared for the stunt, there was one critical oversight that would ultimately prove catastrophic. On October 1st, 1995, at 12:35 p.m., thousands of tourists gathered at the edge of Niagara Falls to witness Robert Overacker's daring stunt. The location was Horseshoe Falls, the largest and most powerful of Niagara's 3 waterfalls, known for its breathtaking drop and relentless churning waters. Among the onlookers was German tourist Manfred Baldus, who captured the moment on video, unaware that he was about to document a disaster. As the footage begins, Robert is seen approaching the brink of the falls, the roar of the water growing louder with each passing second. The anticipation in the air was palpable, with spectators eagerly awaiting what was sure to be a breathtaking display of bravery. Just before reaching the precipice, Robert released his grip on the jet ski with "Save the Homeless" written on the sides of his machine, lifting his hands high into the air, a gesture that seemed to symbolize both triumph and defiance in the face of danger. In an instant, he vanished from sight as he went over the edge, swallowed by the thundering cascade of water. At that critical moment, Robert attempted to deploy his rocket-propelled parachute, a crucial component of his plan meant to ensure his safe descent into the turbulent waters below. However, Robert didn't realize that the parachute had not been adequately attached to him. Instead of carrying him safely down, the parachute fell uselessly into the water, leaving him to plummet into the unforgiving rapids. The realization of this fatal error came too late, and Robert met a tragic end in front of horrified onlookers, including his brother, and a close friend who had accompanied him to the falls. Initially, those who witnessed the incident clung to the hope that Robert might have survived. The powerful rapids tossed his body around, creating the illusion that he was swimming, desperately trying to navigate the deadly waters. But as time passed, the grim reality became clear. Robert had not survived the fall, and the rapids had only added to the tragic spectacle. Tom Dettenbeck, a Parks police dispatcher, compared hitting the water from that height to hitting cement. "You're talking 1 million gallons of water going over the falls in a second," he said. The video, later shared on YouTube by a relative of Baldus, carried a haunting description. "My family was visiting from Germany and just happened to be casually filming when Robert ramped the bleep out of the falls on a jet ski and went out in the best way possible, fists in the air." Schmidt's words, though intended to convey admiration for Robert's bravery, underscored the bittersweet nature of the event, a daring act of defiance that ended in sorrow. Some viewers of the video recounted their own memories of that fateful day. One commenter shared, "I watched this from the balcony of the Falls View Sheraton. It was the morning after a wedding spent at the hotel. The few of us were shaking off cobwebs from the night before and watched this incredulously as it happened." Their words echoed the sense of disbelief and shock that had permeated the crowd that day, as a bold stunt turned into a tragic reminder of the dangers of such stunts. Robert's body was recovered from the water by Maid of Mist staff, and he was pronounced dead at Niagara General Hospital an hour after the stunt. Despite the tragic outcome, Robert Overacker is remembered for his adventurous spirit and desire to raise awareness for a cause he believed in. Robert Overacker's jet ski is immortalized at the Daredevil Museum in Niagara Falls, serving as a powerful and poignant reminder of the risks taken by those who have dared to challenge the mighty falls. The display captures a complex narrative, one of bravery, tragedy, and the relentless human drive to make a difference, even in the face of overwhelming odds. It ensures that his story and the cause he championed will not be forgotten. For Andrew Macaulay, his expedition across the Tasman Sea would be treacherous. Andrew Macaulay was born on August 7, 1968, in Goulburn, New South Wales. As a youngster, Andrew and his brother Michael would embark on adventures that included swimming, tree climbing, and even cliff diving. As a young adult, Andrew Macaulay's fearlessness and hunger for adventure frequently took him around the world. On one trip to Patagonia in the late 1990s, Macaulay found his love for kayaking. After getting caught in a bad storm while mountaineering, he and his friends kayaked through the Chilean fjords. It was then that Macaulay realized the power of the sport. He could still progress through any weather that came his way. After this event, Macaulay dove headfirst into the sport, taking up increasingly difficult challenges. As Andrew moved into adulthood, he began to shape his dreams into goals. His love for nature grew into a calling for extreme kayaking. He sought to take his passion beyond the thrill of whitewater and technical maneuvers. For him, it was about connecting with the vastness of nature in a profoundly intimate way. Andrew's kayaking was not merely a sport. It was a means of pushing his mind and body to their limits and expressing his need to test himself in isolation. His expeditions took him to the cold, turbulent waters and the imposing glaciers of Alaska, each journey adding another layer to his growing legend as an explorer. Macaulay quickly gained a reputation within the kayaking community for his remarkable endurance and ability to face almost insurmountable challenges. His love for exploration was palpable, and it was evident that he was continually searching for something greater than himself. In 2003, Andrew Macaulay became the first person to kayak a direct, non-stop crossing of the Bass Strait, a treacherous stretch of sea between mainland Australia and the island of Tasmania. In total, his 136-mile trip took 35 hours to complete. Another trip included an almost 330-mile journey across the Gulf of Carpentaria, located in northern Australia. The trip took Macaulay a week to complete, and he became familiar with sleeping in his kayak overnight. To commemorate Macaulay's outstanding accomplishments, the Australian Geographic Society awarded Macaulay the Adventurer of the Year award in 2005. Andrew Macaulay was not one to lead a life of quiet contentment. From his youth, he sought the edges of what was considered possible. His adventures began modestly, with hikes and climbs in the Australian wilderness, but as he grew older, his ambitions swelled. With every risk he took, he pushed the boundaries of his body and spirit, finding solace and purpose in the wild. But there was one challenge he couldn't shake from his mind: a solo kayak crossing of the Tasman Sea, an unforgiving stretch of water between Australia and New Zealand. It is approximately 2,000 kilometers or 1,200 miles across at its widest point and covers an area of about 2.3 million square kilometers or 890,000 square miles. Due to strong currents, weather fronts, and waves, the Tasman Sea can be quite hazardous for seafaring. Cyclones and large swells are common, especially during certain times of the year, making it a challenging area for ships and recreational watercraft alike. No one had ever attempted such a crossing, but Andrew believed he could be the first. He knew the Tasman well. It was fierce and wild, a place with 10-meter swells that could swallow a kayak without a trace. To paddle across was an idea teetering on madness, but Andrew, undeterred, said he would do it. Those around him spoke of the risks. His father, a Navy man, recalled the Tasman's violence: swells that rose and fell like mountains, dwarfing the antennas of naval destroyers. And yet, as they described the horrors he might face, Andrew's answer remained firm: yes, he would go. By December 2006, Andrew had prepared himself physically and mentally for the journey. His wife, Vicky, shared his love of adventure and understood the yearning that drove him, even if it meant risking everything. To cross the Tasman, Andrew needed more than just endurance and courage. He needed a kayak that could withstand the Tasman's wrath. With the help of engineers, he designed Kayak One, a vessel equipped with a small capsule where he could rest in cramped, mummy-like confinement. The design was groundbreaking, but it came with limitations. If the kayak capsized, the capsule could potentially flood, leaving Andrew vulnerable. Andrew's mind was unshakable, even as he knew that one misstep could mean disaster. He had trained rigorously, preparing for every conceivable danger, from hypothermia to capsizing. Meteorologists advised him on weather systems, teaching him how to read the clouds and interpret the ocean's moods. In the days leading up to his departure, a quiet sense of confidence replaced his fears. On the day of his departure, Andrew and Vicky held each other tightly on the beach, both reluctant to let go. Vicky, his wife, loved him enough to let him go, but not without fear or pain. The night he left was like something torn in two. Vicky clung to their son, Finley. Their small family joined in a last embrace as she watched her husband push off into the unknown. She didn't ask him to stay, though she wanted to. She knew that asking would be the same as asking him to betray who he was. She shouted goodbye as he paddled away, crying in misery at the idea of leaving his family. His young son yells, "See you in New Zealand, Daddy," and he was gone. On January 11, 2007, 39-year-old Andrew Macaulay paddled away from Australia's coast alone in the vast expanse of the sea. Each day he pushed himself for hours on end, moving ever closer to his dream. He had crossed the Bass Strait, done the Gulf of Carpentaria, each journey building toward this, his last challenge, the Tasman. But this was no ordinary expedition. As he paddled through the Southern Ocean, the wind tore at him, waves rose high as walls, and cold seeped into his bones. Days became nights, nights became a blur of stars, cold, and the relentless, unyielding sea. Fear was his constant companion, but he met it head-on, saying that fear took him places in his mind that the calm world of land never could. Yet he admitted quietly into his radio, "I am scared. This is hard." But he kept going, motivated by the thought of seeing his family again and the chance to make history. His days were filled with silence, interrupted only by the rhythm of his paddling and the occasional call with Vicky, who anxiously awaited each check-in. Vicky and Finley waited for Andrew in their small home, The silence grew heavy as the days passed. There was pride but also dread. When he spoke to Vicky on the radio, his voice cracking, he mentioned the harshness of it all, the exhaustion, the hallucinations, and his decision to turn back once due to hypothermia. Each time he would go as far as he could, test the limits of his body and mind, and then turn back only when he knew he couldn't go further. Yet each time he turned back, it was clear he wouldn't give up. He told Vicky he'd try again, the challenge clinging to him like the salt on his skin. Andrew encountered massive swells and storms, but his spirit remained unbroken. The ocean tested him, sending towering waves that tossed his kayak as if it were a mere speck on the water. He endured sleepless nights, unrelenting cold, and physical exhaustion. Yet his determination never wavered. The journey took him deep into the Tasman, past the point of rescue. His friends told him of the dangers of leaving his family behind, but Andrew could not be moved. This journey, this crossing, was his alone. And so he went further than anyone thought possible, keeping to a strict routine of radio reports and weather updates. Days blended into weeks, the weather's mood shifting from calm to violent storms that battered his small craft. The sea roared around him, but Andrew pressed forward, his mind and body attuned to the waves, the wild winds, and the cold bite of the Southern Ocean. But in the deep of the Tasman, a storm rose, a storm like those that had swallowed ships whole. Andrew's kayak, barely more than a capsule floating on that furious expanse, was buffeted, lifted by waves that loomed over him like giants. 10-meter swells broke over him, the wind clawed at his canopy, and each night he lay trapped inside that kayak, listening to the creaking and groaning of his tiny vessel as it tried to right itself. Inside his tiny capsule, he felt like a prisoner, trapped as the kayak was battered by the ocean. Friends and family back home anxiously awaited his daily transmissions, fearing the worst as hours passed without word from him. Finally, a message came through. All is fine, terrifying start, all okay. The relief was palpable, but Andrew knew the ocean was far from done with him. Despite the storm, Andrew continued to paddle, each mile bringing him closer to his goal. But the strain was taking a toll. Alone in his kayak, he confessed to his camera that he was struggling, questioning his ability to complete the journey. "I'm right at my limit," he admitted, feeling the weight of the miles behind him and the endless ocean ahead. Yet he pushed forward, fueled by the hope of reuniting with Vicky and Finley. 3 weeks into his voyage, Andrew was on the brink of making history. He was within a day's paddle of New Zealand's shore, and everyone, his family, the media, the Rescue Coordination Center, was waiting in anticipation of his arrival. But then came a brief, fragmented transmission. In the early hours of a stormy night, a faint and distorted radio transmission echoed across the airwaves. "Kayak 1, do you copy?" The message was garbled, the voice barely decipherable but unmistakably filled with urgency. The adventurer Andrew McCauley was attempting something extraordinary, and now something had gone wrong. The moment marked the final entry in a story that would be remembered as both inspiring and tragic, a journey that blended courage and heartbreak. Rescue teams scoured the waters, hoping to find him alive. But all they found was his kayak, floating adrift 80 kilometers from New Zealand's Milford Sound. Andrew was nowhere to be seen. The capsule had been damaged in the storm, and a crucial attachment point had broken, making it impossible for him to right the kayak if it capsized. The ocean had claimed him. It was hard to accept that this man who had come so close had been claimed by the sea. Vicky didn't want to believe it. Not until the police brought news, not until she saw the kayak, the hollow shell of what had once carried him so far. She held their son and remembered Andrew as the man he was, brave, stubborn, forever chasing something that others could only dream of. The news of Andrew's disappearance hit hard. Friends, family, and adventurers worldwide mourned the loss of a man who had dared to dream beyond the boundaries of possibility. Vicky and Finley were left with a void that no words could fill, a loss made all the more painful by the knowledge that Andrew had been so close to his goal. He had crossed the Tasman, defied the odds, and pushed himself to the brink, only to be stopped just short of shore. Andrew's story became a symbol of both the beauty and the peril of exploration. He had gone where few dared, touching the raw edge of life in his pursuit of something greater than himself. While some questioned his decision to undertake such a dangerous journey, others saw him as an embodiment of the human spirit's boundless curiosity and resilience. Andrew Macaulay became a legend that day, not because he reached the shore, but because he faced the Tasman and crossed its vast, deadly heart. He made it farther than anyone believed possible. He may not have touched the land of New Zealand, but he crossed that ocean in his small kayak, and those who knew him, those who loved him, knew he had achieved what he'd set out to do. The last words spoken about him were full of pride. He made it. Anyone who said otherwise didn't know Andrew Macaulay or the spirit that drove him, a spirit that, like the Tasman Sea, could not be tamed. For Timothy Treadwell, his Alaskan wilderness excursion would be an unmitigated disaster. Timothy Treadwell wasn't raised as an outdoorsy type of person. He was a man of the suburbs, shaped by the smoothness of asphalt and the hum of commuter trains. His early life was ordinary enough. Born on April 29, 1957, he was a middle-class boy from Long Island with loving parents and a sunny disposition. But in Timothy, there was something restless, something yearning for a world that existed beyond the reach of human civilization. He didn't quite know it yet, but his destiny was tied to the wilderness, to the untamed frontier of the Alaskan wild, where grizzly bears roamed and man was but a guest in their domain. In his 20s, Treadwell drifted. He tried his hand at acting, landing minor roles and chasing the allure of fame in Los Angeles. But his failure in Hollywood, compounded by a battle with addiction, broke him down. At a low point in his life, when the booze tasted sour and the city's lights no longer glowed with promise, he found salvation in a most unexpected place, Alaska, the great expanse of the wild with its vast rivers, towering mountains, and the endless horizon called to him. Timothy reinvented himself as a man of nature, a self-proclaimed protector of grizzly bears. He had seen them once, during a brief excursion to Katmai National Park, and they stirred something deep within him. Bears, massive and ancient, primal forces of nature that cared little for man's ambitions, fascinated him. They were solitary creatures, survivors in an indifferent world. Treadwell saw in them the wildness he sought in himself, a freedom unbounded by society's constraints. And so began his life's work, his passion, and ultimately, his obsession. Timothy Treadwell's first journey to Alaska was not marked by grandeur or a dramatic encounter with the wild. It was, instead, a quiet crossing from one world into another. The plane dipped low over the blue-gray waters of the Shelikof Strait, the jagged peaks of the Alaskan Peninsula. Below him stretched the great wilderness of Katmai National Park, a vast, untamed land of rivers, mountains, and tundra. It was here that the grizzly bears roamed, here where Timothy's soul would find what it had been searching for all along: purpose. Katmai was no place for amateurs. The land was ruled by the bears, massive coastal grizzlies, some weighing more than 1,000 pounds, driven by the cyclical tides of hunger, mating, and survival. Treadwell was a stranger in this land, a visitor who sought to embed himself in its very fabric. That first summer, in the early 1990s, was a tentative dance with the wild. Timothy arrived with no grand plan. He camped along the rivers, watching the bears from a respectful distance, learning their ways in a kind of silent apprenticeship. He was awed by their size, but they seemed to move with an ease and grace that belied their bulk. He watched them wade into the rivers, great arcs of water splashing around them as they scooped salmon from the currents with lazy swipes of their massive paws. It was primal, timeless, and completely removed from the world Timothy had known. The bears at first paid him little attention. To them, Timothy was just another passing shadow, a creature too small and insignificant to warrant much concern. But Treadwell was captivated by them, by their power, their sheer indifference to human existence. For him, this was more than just an escape from the disappointments of his past life. It was a spiritual journey, a quest to find meaning in a world that seemed increasingly disconnected from the natural order. At night, as the Alaskan sun dipped below the horizon and twilight stretched for hours, Timothy would sit outside his tent, listening to the distant sounds of the wilderness. The river gurgled and hissed, the wind swept through the tall grass, and occasionally a bear would huff or growl as it moved through the dark. Timothy felt at peace here, far removed from the chaos of his life in the city, from the expectations of society. Here, he could reinvent himself. As Treadwell became more familiar with Katmai and the bears in the area, he gave them names. To Timothy, they were not just animals. They were personalities, individuals with whom he believed he could form a bond. There was Mr. Chocolate, a towering male whose fur shone dark in the sunlight, and Tabitha, a mother bear who led her cubs along the riverbank with patient authority. Windy was another bear he grew fond of, a young, curious female who often wandered close to his camp, sniffing the air and eyeing him from a distance. Timothy began to talk to them. It was a habit that, at first, seemed odd even to him. But the more he did it, the more natural it felt. He spoke softly, soothingly, as if trying to lull the bears into trusting him, into seeing him not as an intruder, but as one of their own. He filmed himself during these interactions, his voice hushed and reverent as he narrated the bears' actions. To Timothy, each moment with the bears was sacred, a communion with creatures that had lived on this earth long before man had set foot in their realm. But his fascination with the bears quickly grew into something more, a belief that he was destined to protect them. Timothy had always been an idealist, a man who wanted to believe in a cause greater than himself. His early struggles with addiction and failure had left him searching for redemption, and he found it in the wilderness, among the bears. He began to see himself as their guardian, a self-appointed protector against the dangers of poaching and human encroachment. He returned to Katmai each summer, staying longer and longer each time, learning the bears' habits, territories, and personalities. His camera became an extension of himself, capturing the raw beauty of the wilderness, the drama of life and death that played out along the riverbanks. In the footage, he became the narrator of his own story, positioning himself as the voice of the wild, the one who understood the bears in a way no one else could. As the years passed, his relationship with the bears deepened, at least in his mind. He grew bolder, moving closer to them, spending hours sitting by the river, watching them fish, tracking their movements across the tundra. He believed he could predict their behavior and understand their emotions. "I'm the only one who can do this. I know these bears. I know how to live with them," he would proclaim to his camera. His methods, however, drew criticism from wildlife experts and park rangers. They warned him that he was getting too close, that his presence among the bears was dangerous, both for him and for the animals. But Timothy brushed off their concerns. To him, they were outsiders, people who didn't understand the bond he had forged with the bears. He saw their warnings as obstacles, attempts to keep him from his mission. The deeper Timothy immersed himself in the wilderness, the more isolated he became, not just from society, but from the reality of his own limitations. He began to see himself as a kind of messianic figure, a man with a sacred duty to protect the bears from the evils of the human world. In interviews, he spoke passionately about his work, the dangers the bears faced from hunters and poachers, and the encroachment of industry. He railed against the government, accusing them of neglecting the bears and failing to protect the wilderness from human greed. But for all his passion, there was a growing sense of delusion in his words. Timothy was not just an observer anymore. He believed he was a part of the bears' world, that they saw him as one of their own. He began staying later into the season, long after most people had left the park, long after the bears had grown more aggressive and hungrier as the days shortened and hibernation loomed. The danger was real, But Timothy believed in the purity of his cause, in the righteousness of his mission. He stopped carrying bear spray or any form of protection, convinced the bears would never harm him. "I would rather die for these animals than live for anything else," he once said, a chilling proclamation of his willingness to put his life on the line for the creatures he had grown to love. By the late 1990s, Timothy's annual pilgrimages to Katmai had become legendary in the small world of wildlife conservationists and park authorities. He had created his own myth, the story of the man who lived with the bears, who understood them in a way no one else could. He began to see himself not just as a protector, but as a martyr, a man who had been chosen by the wilderness to be its voice, its guardian. By 2001, his fame grew as he gave interviews, appeared on television, and even wrote a book about his experiences. But with fame came scrutiny, and not all of it was positive. Many wildlife experts criticized him for his reckless behavior, for anthropomorphizing the bears, and for crossing the line between observer and participant. To them, Timothy was not helping the bears, he was endangering them by blurring the boundaries between human and wild. But Timothy refused to listen. His trips to Katmai had become more than just a passion. They were an obsession, a need. Each year, as spring arrived, he felt the pull of the wilderness, the call of the bears. He couldn't stay away, couldn't imagine a life that didn't involve the rugged, untamed beauty of the Alaskan wild. And so, despite the warnings, despite the growing danger, Timothy continued to return to Katmai, each trip pushing him further into the wilderness, further into his own myth. The Alaskan wilderness, with its vast, indifferent beauty, was both his sanctuary and his proving ground. He returned every summer for 13 years, setting up camp near the bears, learning their habits and understanding their movements. They were not just animals to him, they were friends, companions in the silence of the wilderness. The bears allowed him to be close, closer than most humans had ever dared. To Timothy, this was a kind of unspoken bond, a communion between man and beast. He believed they trusted him, and in turn, he trusted them. In September 2003, as fall came and the warmth of summer was gone, most of the tourists and other campers went with it. The bears had grown heavy with salmon, their bodies fattened and sluggish, and they moved slower now, conserving energy for the long months of hibernation that lay ahead. Timothy Treadwell, however, was still there, still in his tent, the damp earth beneath him and the constant sound of the river rushing by his side. He stayed late that year, later than he should have. The rangers had already warned him. They told him that the fall season was dangerous, that the bears were unpredictable as the days shortened and the food grew scarcer. But Timothy didn't listen. He never did. He felt that the bears needed him, that they relied on him somehow, though he could never explain exactly how. It was October 2003, and by then, Timothy was not just an observer of the bears. He was part of their landscape. At least, that's what he believed. For 13 summers, he had returned to the Alaskan wilderness, to the same rivers and valleys, watching the same bears. He knew them all by sight, their faces, their scars, their movements. They were like old friends to him now, though no one else saw them that way. Timothy spoke to the camera as if he were narrating his own story, as if his life and the lives of the bears were one long, unfolding drama. "This is my final year with them," he'd say, as he often did, though it was never true. There was always another year, always another reason to return. The wilderness had become his life, and the bears were more than just animals to him. They were companions, family, and perhaps even a reflection of himself, wild, misunderstood, and living on the edge of a world that didn't care about them. His companion that fall was his girlfriend, Amy Huguenard, a quiet woman with wide, nervous eyes. She had joined him in the wilderness before, but she wasn't like Timothy. She didn't feel at home out there, not the way he did. The bears frightened her. She didn't say it, not to him, but he could see it in the way she moved, always staying a little closer to camp, constantly glancing over her shoulder when she heard a rustle in the trees. Timothy assured her there was nothing to fear. "The bears won't hurt us," he'd say. "They know us. They trust us." Amy didn't believe him, but she followed him anyway, drawn to his passion, to the way he seemed so alive out there in the wild. She had seen him in the city, how lost he was, how out of place he felt in the world of people. In Alaska, with the bears, Timothy was different. He was sure of himself, confident, and filled with a kind of quiet joy that was contagious. For a while, she could forget the fear. But as the days grew shorter and the cold began to creep into their camp, the bears changed. They were hungrier now, more aggressive. The fish were no longer running thick in the rivers, and the bears that Timothy had known so well seemed distant, different. They fought more, their tempers short, their movements restless. Some had already left, heading up into the mountains to find their dens for the long sleep ahead. But a few remained, wandering the valleys, searching for the last scraps of food before the snow set in. One bear in particular caught Timothy's attention that fall. He hadn't seen this one before, and that troubled him. Most of the bears in Katmai were familiar to him by now, but this one was new. A large old male with a thick, ragged coat and a mean look in his eyes. He wasn't like the others. He didn't fish in the river, didn't interact with the bears Timothy had come to know. He kept his distance from the others, stalking through the underbrush, his head low, his movements deliberate and slow, like an animal conserving energy for a fight. Timothy called him the big guy. He wasn't sure what to make of him. Most bears ignored Timothy, or, at the very least, tolerated his presence. But this one was different. There was something in the way he moved, the way he watched them from the edges of the camp, his eyes narrowing as they passed by. Timothy felt it too, a kind of tension in the air whenever the bear was near. But still, Timothy stayed. He filmed himself daily, narrating the bear's movements, explaining to his future audience what it was like to live among them. There were moments when the wild seemed to seep into him, to change him. His voice, once calm and measured, took on a frantic edge. "They're all I have. Without them, I'm nothing," he said as Amy watched him quietly, the fear in her growing with each passing day. She didn't say anything. She didn't want to break the fragile spell that kept him tethered to reality, but she knew. She knew that something had changed, that the bears were not the same creatures Timothy had come to love, that the wilderness was growing cold, indifferent to his presence. It was late October, and the last light had faded from the valley when the silence was broken. Timothy and Amy were in their tent, the thin nylon walls doing little to hold back the chill of the Alaskan night. Timothy was talking, as he always did, about the bears, how they were preparing for the long sleep, how they trusted him, how he was going to protect them. And then there was a sound, a low growl from the edge of the camp, deep and guttural, like something out of a nightmare. Amy tensed. Timothy looked at her, his eyes wide but steady. "It's nothing, just one of the bears passing by," he said, but she knew better. Something was in the air, a heaviness, a presence that hadn't been there before. She could feel it, the way the night seemed to close in around them, and the wind had gone still as if holding its breath. Then the growl came again, closer this time, louder. Timothy unzipped the tent flap and stepped out into the cold. The sky was dark, the stars obscured by clouds. And there, at the edge of the clearing, stood the bear, the big guy. His eyes glinted dimly, his massive frame hulking in the shadows. "Go on, get out of here," Timothy said softly, raising his arms in a gesture meant to scare the bear off. But the bear didn't move. He stood there, watching, his breath steaming in the cold night air. Amy was frozen, her heart hammering in her chest. She wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't move. She could only watch as the bear began to advance, slowly, one massive paw at a time, until he was just a few feet from where Timothy stood. "Go on!" Timothy yelled now, his voice rising in panic. He picked up a nearby rock and hurled it at the bear, but it didn't flinch. The bear moved closer, his head low, his eyes fixed on Timothy, and then it happened faster than either of them could react. The bear lunged, his jaws snapping down on Timothy's arm, pulling him to the ground in a flash of teeth and claws. Amy screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the roar of the bear, the sound of flesh tearing. the wet, heavy thud of Timothy's body hitting the ground. It was over in seconds. The wilderness, which had seemed so alive just moments before, fell silent once again. The only sound was the wind, howling through the trees like a ghost. In the end, it wasn't the wilderness that killed Timothy Treadwell. It was his own belief that he could conquer it and somehow live among the bears as one of them. Timothy, for all his passion, for all his love of the bears, was just another man in their world, a man who had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. Timothy Treadwell's camp was still when they found it. The Rangers arrived by float plane, touching down on the cold, clear water of Kaflia Bay. It was October, and the valley felt empty, as if the world itself had withdrawn from this place. They knew something was wrong before they landed. The pilot had seen the signs, a bear too close to the camp, moving slow and heavy, its belly full of something that shouldn't have been there. He'd radioed the Park Service, describing what he saw. The Rangers came quickly, though they already had a sense of what they would find. Timothy had stayed too long that year, everyone knew it. When they stepped out of the plane and into the wet grass, the first thing they noticed was the silence. The wilderness is never truly silent. There is always the sound of wind in the trees, the rush of the river, the distant call of a bird. But here, now, it was different. It was a thick, oppressive quiet, as if the land itself was holding its breath. They found the remains of Timothy Treadwell and Amy Huguenard scattered in the clearing, what little was left of them. The bear, the big old male, had come in the night, tearing through the tent as though it were made of paper, dragging Timothy out into the open. The ground was churned up, the grass matted with blood and dirt. A trail of fur and bone led away from the camp, disappearing into the trees. Timothy's camera had been running when the attack began, but it captured only sound. The desperate, breathless struggle between man and beast, the frantic cries, the growl of the bear, the final, awful silence. When the Rangers listened to the recording later, they sat in stunned quiet. The wilderness had claimed him, in the end, just as they'd always known it would. Timothy had believed he could live among the bears, but the wild had its own rules, its own brutal order. The Rangers put down the bear. It was a mercy, though some would say it wasn't necessary. The bear was only doing what bears do, surviving. It had been a poor season for salmon, and the bears were leaner than usual, hungrier. The old male had been scavenging near the camp when it happened. Timothy had stayed too late, past when the bears were preparing for hibernation, when they became desperate and unpredictable. He had always believed they would never harm him, that his connection with them was stronger than their instincts. But Timothy had been wrong. As the Rangers cleaned up the camp, packing away what little remained, they found his journals, tapes, and the endless hours of footage he'd shot over the years. He had recorded everything: his conversations with the bears, his thoughts on the wilderness, his rants against the government, and the poachers he believed were out to destroy the land. The tapes were full of passion, full of life. Timothy, always standing in the frame, the wild behind him, the bears moving in the distance like shadows. In those tapes, Timothy was a man on a mission, a hero in his own story. He spoke about the bears with a kind of reverence, his voice filled with wonder and awe. "I'm here to protect them," he would say. "They need me. Without me, they'll be lost." And yet, as the years went by, as he returned to the Alaskan wilderness summer after summer, something else crept into his words. Desperation, maybe, or madness. A man who believed too much in his own legend, who had forgotten that the wilderness does not care about the stories men tell. He had stayed too long. That was the truth of it. Timothy Treadwell had always stayed too long, pushing the boundaries of safety, ignoring the warnings from the Rangers and the experts who told him that the bears were not his friends, that they were wild animals driven by instincts older than humanity. But Timothy couldn't see that. He didn't want to. He had wrapped himself in the wilderness, made it his identity, his salvation. Without the bears, he was nothing, just a man lost in the noise and confusion of the modern world. The Rangers packed up the last of his things and left the valley. After his death, people talked about Timothy, The media picked up his story, and soon, everyone knew about the Grizzly Man who had lived with the bears and died by their claws. Some called him a hero, a man who had dedicated his life to protecting the wilderness, a martyr for a cause greater than himself. Others called him a fool, a reckless dreamer who had paid the price for his hubris. But the bears didn't care. The wilderness didn't care. They went on as they always had, moving through the valleys and rivers, fattening themselves on salmon, fighting for territory, and preparing for the long winter sleep. The land was indifferent, as it always had been, as it always would be. The tapes Timothy left behind became the heart of a film, a documentary, Grizzly Man, that would tell his story to the world. But in the end, the legacy of Timothy Treadwell was not about the bears. It was about a man who had crossed a line, who had pushed himself too far into the wild, believing that he could bridge the gap between man and nature. He had become obsessed with the idea that he was different, that the rules of the wild didn't apply to him, but the wilderness does not bend to the will of man. It exists beyond our understanding, beyond our need to impose meaning on it. The bears would go on. They had lived for centuries before Timothy came to them, and they would live for centuries after. But Timothy Treadwell was gone, consumed by the very thing he had loved so deeply. Timothy had crossed the line, and he had paid the price. Timothy Treadwell's legacy is complex, blending passionate conservation efforts, personal obsession, and tragic consequences. Treadwell's devotion to the protection of grizzly bears and his work to raise public awareness about the importance of preserving wildlife were central to his legacy. His message was about the need to respect and safeguard these creatures, whom he saw as misunderstood and threatened by human encroachment. His extensive footage and documentation of grizzly bear behavior have provided valuable insights into these magnificent animals and their ecosystem. In essence, Timothy Treadwell's legacy is one of devotion and passion for wildlife, but also one of tragic overreach. His life stands as both an inspiring story of one man's dedication to nature and a cautionary tale about the dangers of misinterpreting the wild world. For Johnny Strange, his base jump would be a disaster. Born on December 26, 1991, Johnny's passion for adventure seemed ingrained from birth. Johnny's fearlessness had been apparent from a young age when he jumped off a chair in his mother's bedroom and hit the bed frame, leading to a rushed trip to the hospital where he would continue his daredevil antics. "I remember thinking, what do I do with this kid?" his mom recalled. Johnny's best friend, Trevor Jacob, often joins him on wild adventures. Trevor has known Johnny since they were young, bonded by a shared love of pushing their physical boundaries. Together they were the wild boys of Malibu, always challenging themselves and each other. While some saw Johnny as a living legend among his peers, others, particularly the parents, viewed him as a nightmare. He lived without fear, was always full of energy and enthusiasm, and was never afraid to do things others wouldn't even consider. His unique spirit was infectious. Whenever he had a new challenge or adventure, he would rub his hands together, flash a big grin, and throw himself headfirst into whatever lay ahead. Johnny's zest for life was evident in everything he did. At his high school graduation, he famously lit a cigar on stage as he walked to collect his diploma. Johnny's passion for extreme sports had deep roots. Both his parents were adventurous risk-takers, and Johnny seemed to inherit their fearless spirit. Johnny's journey began when his father, an avid climber, was planning an expedition to climb Mount Vinson, the tallest mountain in Antarctica, and young Johnny insisted on joining. Despite his father's concerns, Johnny's determination was unshakable. At 12 years old, he showed the kind of determination that would come to define him. Initially, the team members were skeptical about having a child on such a challenging climb, but Johnny quickly proved his worth. He carried his load, kept pace, and conversed confidently with the adults. He even celebrated his 13th birthday on the trip, receiving an ice axe as a gift, which he wielded with surprising skill for someone so young. Despite the sub-zero temperatures, Johnny climbed as if it were nothing, showing no signs of fear or hesitation. Johnny's ambition grew from there. He set his sights on becoming the youngest to climb the 7 summits, the highest peaks on each continent. Everest, the tallest and most daunting of them all, was his ultimate goal. He would complete all 6 by 17, with only one left. On Everest, he faced significant challenges, including dangerous icefalls and avalanches that claimed the lives of other climbers. But on the day they reached the summit, the conditions were perfect. The view was breathtaking, and Johnny stood at the highest point on Earth, triumphant and undeterred. While his efforts caused controversy within the climbing community, he kept climbing. And at 17, he completed all 7 mountains. His achievements earned him recognition, and he was soon featured on television for becoming the youngest person to complete the feat. Johnny's climbs were not just about setting records. He was deeply connected to the places he visited and the people he met along the way. During his climb to Everest, he was particularly drawn to the monks who lived in the mountains. Admiring their dedication to their spiritual practice, Johnny used his climbs to raise awareness for causes he cared deeply about. Understanding how fortunate he was and wanting to give back in any way he could. For Johnny Strange, life was about pushing boundaries, defying expectations, and living with a purpose that went beyond the thrill of the moment. At 17, after climbing Everest in 2009 and completing the 7 summits, Strange was back in Malibu. He reunited with Trevor and continued their mischievous adventures. Johnny and Trevor were inseparable during this period, fueled by a mutual drive for notoriety and thrill-seeking. They began making videos of their daring stunts, hoping to gain recognition among their peers. One day, Johnny had the idea to skateboard down the 101 freeway, a stretch of highway known for its steep sections and fast-moving traffic. The day would become one of many such stunts in their shared history. Johnny would gain more notoriety, but not in a positive way, as he was caught car surfing in Malibu. The stunt made the local news, forcing him to issue an apology. Strange could never get enough speed. Johnny's hunger for adrenaline took him from the Malibu streets to the top of some of the world's most challenging peaks. He was even setting his sights on breaking skateboarding speed world records. However, Johnny had grown restless with climbing mountains and skateboarding, pushing him toward the next risky move to satisfy his craving for speed. At 18, Johnny moved to Las Vegas, determined to learn everything he could about base jumping and wingsuit flying. It was a move he had planned for years, knowing he'd have to wait until he was legally old enough to skydive. A sport that began as a rebel offshoot of skydiving had evolved into a popular and respected derivative of rock climbing. Due to its inherent risks and the need for precise execution, base jumping is considered one of the most extreme and adrenaline-pumping adventure sports, attracting thrill-seekers who are willing to push the boundaries of human capabilities and experience the exhilaration of free-falling from unique and challenging locations. He arrived in Vegas with a clear goal: to learn from the best. He walked into a local jump zone and without hesitation told the instructors he wanted to learn how to base jump. His natural talent and physical awareness allowed him to progress quickly through skydiving. After gaining the necessary experience, he moved on to more advanced jumps, starting with safe objects like bridges and hot air balloons. For Johnny, adrenaline was a high that ordinary life couldn't provide. The more he accomplished, the more he craved the next challenge. Matt Rosado crossed paths with Johnny while skydiving in Paris Valley, California. At the time, he didn't know much about his accomplishments. To me, he was just another guy who loved jumping, always bringing fun and excitement to every dive. He seemed like an ordinary person enjoying an extraordinary hobby. But there was more to Johnny than met the eye. He was fast, skilled, and absolutely in love with the thrill of flying, Rosado proclaimed. Johnny approached the sport methodically, progressing through each stage of training with discipline. He started by learning the fundamentals of skydiving before moving on to base jumping. Only after hundreds of jumps and nearly a year in the sport did he finally qualify to jump with a wingsuit. People didn't know how Strange funded his passion, but it turned out he was making money by posting videos of his adventures online. He didn't need much. He traveled light, packing just a few clothes, and relied on sponsorships to cover most of his expenses. At the time, Johnny was also pursuing the Explorer's Grand Slam, which included climbing the 7 summits and reaching both the North and South Poles. After reaching the South Pole, he set his sights on the North Pole, where he planned to parachute from a helicopter. He was warned about the dangers. Parachutes could freeze and fail to open in the extreme cold. Despite these warnings, Johnny was determined to make the jump. The night before he was set to leave for the North Pole, his excitement was palpable. His guide, Vern Tegis, discussed the challenges ahead, including the reduced atmosphere at the poles, which could throw off altimeter readings by thousands of feet. Vern would warn Johnny, stating, "I was trying to stress at that point that you only live once. Let's make it good, but let's make it long. You mentioned earlier that you have a great love of life and that you want to be around having fun for many years. I salute that." Strange replied, "I want to be an old man with cool stories." As the jump approached, his mother felt sick with worry, fearing the worst. She knew the dangers all too well. Johnny would have 2 Russian guides jumping with him, and they cautioned him against trying any stunts as he exited the helicopter. But true to form, Johnny couldn't resist. He performed a backflip out of the door. Johnny was alive and had successfully parachuted into the North Pole, setting another record. He called his mother moments later. Johnny had now fulfilled all the necessary requisites to progress to base jumping with a wingsuit. At the time, the sport was an underground and unregulated sport in a small community. With perhaps 2,000 people worldwide participating in base jumping, fewer than 1,000 specialized in wingsuit base jumping. Among those, less than 200 flew in proximity to the terrain. Just a handful pushed the limits further to fly the most dangerous lines, skimming close to rocks, trees, and cliffs at speeds reaching 200 miles per hour. Proximity flying, where jumpers fly dangerously close to the ground or obstacles, offered a sensation of speed and control that only a few experienced. It was a high-risk endeavor, where being truly present in the moment was the best feeling in the world. Johnny was very aware of the risks and knew they were always part of the equation, but the reward, the feeling of flying, of living on the edge, was worth it. And so, despite the dangers, he kept pushing forward, always chasing the next leap into the unknown. Friends and family knew better than to try and stop him. Holding him back wasn't an option. Johnny was determined, strong-willed, and impatient, always eager to learn at his own pace, often pushing beyond what others considered safe. Matt Rosado believed he was not taking the necessary time to learn the sport. Johnny is incredibly focused and strong-minded when it comes to uncomfortable situations, but he's very impatient in terms of his learning process. So I took a step back from Johnny, just a step away so he could learn a bit on his own, Matt stated. His love for the sport took him across the globe to the towering peaks of Switzerland, France, and Norway. There were still so many uncharted spots, untouched mountains waiting to be jumped, and Johnny was determined to find them. Johnny's European journey began when base jumper Alex Mizyuk offered him a lift around Europe since Strange could not rent a car. They traveled in Alex's van for 2 weeks, camping at the foot of mountains they planned to jump, living simply, waking each day to climb, jump, and fly. This would start a friendship between the two. As Johnny returned to the U.S., he planned another European trip with Alex. A few weeks before the next planned trip to Europe, Johnny was training for a big jump by leaping from a hot air balloon, believing it was the ultimate way to train. But the training didn't go as planned. Johnny had a severe malfunction mid-air, his parachute failing, forcing him into a terrifying descent. He barely managed to regain control, narrowly avoiding disaster. It was a close call, and though Johnny brushed it off, his demeanor seemed off in the days that followed. As the day of his trip approached, Johnny seemed distant, his usual confidence waning. Trevor noticed something was wrong while driving to the train station, and the concern lingered. Johnny was heading to Europe, planning to jump off some of the continent's biggest peaks, but his energy felt subdued. He brushed off questions about how he was feeling, insisting he was fine. But those who knew him sensed something was different, Trevor recalled. There was a strange, foreboding feeling in the air. The conversation with friends and family, the close call in the balloon, the teary goodbyes, all the signs seemed to point to something. But Johnny pushed forward, as he always did. It was who he was, and no one could stop him. In September of 2015, he headed to Europe. The destination was Gitchen, Switzerland, a famous mountain range known for its perfect jumps and proximity flights. It was a place that offered the kind of thrill Johnny craved, terrain flying the entire way down. When he met up with Alex, they spent the evening in a small cafe, studying maps, watching videos of others who had jumped before them, and planning their line down the mountain, eager for what the next day would bring. The following day, they packed everything, threw it into the van, and set off for the hike. The morning of October 2nd, 2015 was beautiful, with scattered clouds and snow-capped mountains visible in the distance. Nothing that would deter them from jumping. They started their hike using a small wooden cable car meant to bring supplies up the mountain to cover the first few hundred feet. The rest of the climb was on foot. As they climbed, they began to feel strong, gusty winds that would occasionally die down for minutes at a time. They discussed the conditions as they planned their jump carefully, knowing that the wind could be dangerous. The technique was to jump out and keep their wings closed initially, staying in a pencil position until they had enough airspeed to open them safely. For Johnny, this jump was the shortest start he had ever done, meaning the cliff offered only 6 seconds to impact. The wingsuit would take at least 2 to 3 seconds to inflate and start flying, leaving little room for error. Fully geared up, cameras rolling, they stood at the edge, waiting for the right moment. Alex recalled, "So we waited for quite a few minutes, fully geared up, cameras filming, waiting to jump, waiting for a lull in the wind. I was fully confident about it. I was loving life. We both were. We're both on top of the world. Everything was perfect until it suddenly wasn't anymore." They had waited on that mountain, analyzing the wind and timing their jumps. When the moment came, Johnny went first. As he launched off the cliff, he was slightly tilted, and Alex could tell it was a bad jump. Johnny was immediately in trouble, going head low as he descended. Reviewing the footage later, it became clear just how severe his exit had been. He had flipped entirely over, flying vertically down for the first 4 to 5 seconds, unable to gain lift from his suit. Alex filmed Strange impacting on the side of the mountain. Alex had no choice but to fly himself. The thought of deploying his parachute and landing immediately crossed his mind, but it would have only put him on the side of the mountain, far from help. He had to continue flying, keeping control for a full minute and a half before opening his parachute. He landed at the designated spot. That was an out-of-body experience for me. I was screaming in flight because I knew it happened. I opened pretty high after a minute and a half of flying and landed in the same spot where we had planned to land, at the restaurant where we'd been hanging out the night before. I pretty much collapsed in the landing area, Alex recalled. Johnny Strage was just 23 years old at the time of his death. At 5:30 in the morning, back home, Johnny's father, Brian Strange's phone rang, and as he answered, he immediately sensed something was terribly wrong. Even before any words were spoken, he knew what had happened. Elsewhere, Johnny's friends and family received similar calls. The impact of his loss left a void, each of them grappling with the unanswered questions and the pain of losing someone who lived life on the edge, always seeking the next great adventure. For Johnny, the thrill of wingsuit flying wasn't just an addiction, it was an integral part of who he was. He was fiercely committed to the sport, refusing to let fear or the pleas of loved ones hold him back. He would often brush off concerns, especially when it came to discussing the risks. In his heart, Johnny knew the dangers. He knew he was risking everything with every jump, but the pull of the sport was too strong. He couldn't imagine life without a wingsuit flying. His legacy was more than just a series of jumps. It was about pushing boundaries, living courageously, and embracing the unknown. He lived as if every day could be his last, pouring everything into his passions and leaving nothing on the table. Even in his final moments, Johnny's commitment to his sport and his life philosophy never wavered. Those who knew Johnny best saw him as a young man who lived life to the fullest. He achieved more with his 23 years on this earth than many would in their lifetimes. From the North Pole to the South Pole, From towering peaks in Nepal to the rugged cliffs of Patagonia, Johnny loved life fiercely and his energy was infectious. In a letter to himself, Johnny Strange wrote, "I'm not scared of flying. I'm not scared of dying. I'm scared of loving these people. I'm scared of the day they lose me. I'm scared because I know they'll hurt. I know they'll miss me, and I know they'll think that I didn't care enough about them to stop jumping. That's the worst part. I wish I could make them understand without having them jump. If I had a son of my own, I would pray inside that he never jumped. But once he did, I would know that there is nothing I can possibly do to stop him." The wind doesn't care for your dreams. The rock doesn't yield to your ambition. The ocean doesn't honor your resolve. These things you challenge are not your adversaries, nor are they your allies. They simply are immutable, eternal. And you, flesh, blood, and bone, you are fragile. You are brief. Every reckless step you take onto that ledge is a contract with fate, a gamble with odds you can never fully measure. The thrill of freefall, the joy of conquering the unclimbable, it burns bright, yes, but it burns fast. And sometimes it burns you whole. Hubris is the quiet voice that whispers, "Not me. I'll be fine." Hubris is the lie that sends men to their graves and leaves their loved ones to mourn beneath a sky that neither weeps nor smiles. To live is to risk, yes. To embrace danger is to know what it means to feel alive. But do not chase death under the guise of life. Do not mistake your defiance for dominance. The earth has no memory of you. The sea has no sympathy for you. The sky does not know your name. Live boldly, but do not mistake recklessness for courage. Respect the limits, not out of fear, but out of an understanding that every adventure brings you face to face with an outdoor disaster. If you've made it this far, please consider clicking those subscribe and like buttons. Want more outdoor disasters content? Check out these videos I believe you'll enjoy. Thank you for watching.